prior to the turn of the last century, meaning 1900s to 2000s, southern pine beetle outbreaks, often involving the loss of thousands of hectares of pine habitat, red-cockaded woodpecker habitat, occurred every, 7 to 10 years. And since that period, for reasons that I don't understand, I don't know that anybody understands them, those outbreaks no longer occur. Southern pine beetle is almost endangered itself. But anyway, back when these big outbreaks were happening every decade or so, all the species of southern pines were susceptible, although Loblolly pine was the one that was the preferred species for planting and now has replaced longleaf and dominates the landscape across the south, is one of the more highly susceptible ones. Longleaf which was largely replaced by Loblolly, is highly resistant due to a more copious resin production that is it's the defense, one of the defenses of the trees against beetle activity. So the landscape has changed greatly from the point of view of the southern pine beetle. It's much more conducive to these big outbreaks than it was 100 years ago. The ecosystem is overall much more vulnerable to outbreaks than it was in the past. And as a consequence, thousands of hectares of habitat and hundreds of cavity trees are at risk of mortality, or were at risk of mortality in just a few months' time. I mean, these outbreaks could occur during a summer and take out huge swaths of red-cockaded woodpecker habitat, timber resource, and so forth. Conversely, as the developing beetle in the dying trees in an outbreak situation produces superabundance of prey, namely the beetles themselves and their larvae and so forth. But even between epidemics, when there were years of low beetle abundance, there were always a few infested trees around. That low abundance of dying trees provided a very consistent and significant food source for red-cockaded woodpeckers. And if you would follow foraging groups around, they would often go first thing in the morning when they'd come off the roost, they would go to the nearest southern pine beetle infested tree and maybe feed there for an hour or more on that one tree. And that was a very substantial benefit to them. And so there's this sort of tug between lots of cavity trees or most of your habitat to southern pine beetles during outbreaks versus this kind of constant food supply of fairly high quality or very high quality during the years between outbreaks. But from a management point of view, control of southern pine beetles is difficult, complex, and raised strong emotions, I guess, among managers. Effective methods currently involve cutting of trees, often healthy trees, around an outbreak, often in considerable numbers, sometimes hundreds of trees if it's a big spot. And these control measures must be rapidly applied, resembling really a response to fires in terms of the short duration of time where you need to get out and address this issue, because these spots can grow extremely rapidly and they just mushroom and grow. There's more and more periphery for them to grow and infest more and more acres at a more rapid rate. So it can be a big problem. And in the 80s and 90s, there were huge outbreaks across the South, especially in Texas. We had some major outbreaks. So the differences of opinion over control versus no control, strategies for control developed between conservationists, the U.S. Forest Service, timber interests. It was a very contentious issue. And the red-cockaded woodpecker was kind of caught in the middle of these differing opinions and eventually resulted in litigation and became quite a deal. The issues remain largely unresolved, and should southern pine beetle epidemics return to the region, which I suppose they could at any time, the red-cockaded woodpecker southern pine beetle debate will return as well. Who knows what the consequences of that will be. And the more time passes, the more managers and landowners and so forth tend to forget what worked and what didn't work and just how to manage these big epidemics. That's true, I fear, of personnel in the Forest Service as well as the timber companies and, small private landowners. It's going to be a lot of relearning the lessons of the past.